Welcome back. Today I wanted to explore the basis of our own breath and the power it delivers to our body, to our physical body, our mental, emotional, and spiritual bodies, and the effect it has on us. Such a simple act, such a simple thing. As I'm speaking, obviously I'm taking my own breaths. Yet the power of it is almost underestimated. Not by all, of course. For centuries and many centuries, we've had yogic traditions that have really embodied the power of breath and that it has on us. In fact, interestingly, historically, yoga began with the practice of breathing. That was breath work. And then later movement was introduced. So when we dive into the basics of breathing, we can really unravel the power of breath and breath work that it has on our being. And I wanted to share this exploration together with you from a little book, which is called The Science of Breath. And it's a practical guide. It's very short. It was written by Swami Rama, as well as Rudolph Ballentine, an MD, and Alan Himes, MD. It's very short, once again, yet the first chapter, chapter 1, which I'll share with you, is titled Why Bother with Breath? Such a simple act, such a small thing that we all do, yet we are not always mindful about our own breathing, so we often have to take time out of our day to really be present with our own breathing. We call that meditation. And there are times when we just pause and put everything down and take a few deep, mindful breaths. So there are different ways to connect with our own breath. But why bother with breath? So let's explore this together. And I think there are a few really interesting concepts that these authors present to us that we can really not just sit with and contemplate, but really embody with our own daily breathing that we do and often don't do mindfully. So let's take a look. Why bother with breath? Yoga and the body of energy. Many readers will be surprised to find a whole book devoted to the subject of breathing, for the study of breath has not received much attention in Western medicine. In a letter to the editor printed in a well-known medical journal, a physician was complaining about the time and money wasted on research in trivial areas. The next thing you know, he lamented, someone will be writing a book-length dissertation on how to breathe. He couldn't imagine a subject more trifling or a process more obvious than breathing. Of course, breathing is a vital process. If you don't breathe, you don't live, so everyone will agree it's important in that sense. Yet most of us would say either you're breathing or you're not. If you are breathing, there's no problem. If you're not breathing, you're dead. So you're not having any problems either. Perhaps it's not that simple. In Eastern traditions have long been those who would spend decades studying the breath. In fact, there are entire monasteries where most of the focus centers around breathing, and it is said that many of the so-called miracles performed by yogis are based primarily on control of the breath. But why would so much emphasis be placed on an ordinary, everyday process like breathing? The mind-body problem. Our difficulty in understanding why breathing might be so strategic stems in part from our Western way of looking at the world. Our perspective is based primarily on the study of material phenomena. We take solid things and analyze them physically and chemically. Our laboratory science is based on the measurement and manipulation of matter. Our physicians are trained in anatomy and physiology. Our philosophy is basically materialistic. In a similar way, our approach to understanding the human being is primarily physical. It is essentially based on the study of the body, the part we can touch, the measurable aspect of our being. The scientific studies we feel most comfortable with are those with which treat what is objectively observable. When our research strays from the world of material objects and attempts the study of phenomena beyond the reach of our senses, we begin to feel a bit less sure of ourselves, and the question inevitably arises, is this really scientific? These doubts about the scientific validity of non-physical studies are especially evident with respect to research in psychology. Yet the mind is obviously another real level of our existence, one with which we cannot avoid coming to terms. The contemporary Westerner's interest in the mind is equaled only by uncertainty about how to approach it. It can't be dissected or measured or put in a box. It can be put on slides and viewed under a microscope. It can be tested with electronic instruments. Yet, our subjective experience assures us that there is such a thing as the mind and that it is important. We're all aware of our thoughts. We're aware that something is going on inside, and we admit, however grudgingly, that the workings of our mind are in some way behind most of what we do with our physical body and how we manipulate the physical world. Yet in the West, we remain confused about the relationship between the mental realm and the tangible world. How does the physical body interact with the mind? This is more than a theoretical question. The problem of mind-body interaction is one that plagues our medical scientists and baffles our psychologists. When physicians fail to alter the physical body to their patient's satisfaction, they throw up their hands and say the problem must be psychological. When psychologists are unable to help patients recognize their mental world, they shrug and say perhaps you should see a medical doctor to make sure there's not some physical problem here. Patients shuttle back and forth between frustrated psychotherapists and puzzle physicians with the psychosomatic specialists who would understand the integration of mind and body are yet to appear on the scene. How do the mind and body connect? Western science seems to have run into a dead end on the question, but the philosophy of the East, especially that out of which the science of yoga grew, offers a context within which some answers may emerge. For yoga includes the study of both the physical and mental realms. And those two levels of functioning constitute only a small part of the total spectrum of phenomena encompassed in the study of yoga. Since ancient times, yoga masters have spent many long hours going within themselves, studying and trying to unravel the connections existing between their various levels of existence. They discovered that besides the physical body and the mind, there are higher levels of functioning which are also important. For instance, they uncovered and explored an area of consciousness beyond thought, a non-conceptual level of heightened and broadened awareness that could only be approached by stepping outside the arena of our everyday thinking process. The technique of inward attention, which allows one to explore this level of consciousness, is called meditation. Meditation is a method used to deal with those levels of human function operating beyond the mind, what we might call higher consciousness. Meditation is not, however, the only aspect of yoga. Yoga also includes physical postures, asanas, which teach the practitioner to control, regulate, and be aware of his or her physical body. Then there are practices that have to do with the manipulation and regulation of purely mental functions, concentration, for instance. Yoga understands the human as a multi-leveled being, one with a series of distinct levels of existence: the physical, the mental, and what lies beyond the mind. But in our discussion so far, we have omitted mention of another important level which lies between the mind and the body. For according to yoga, the mind and the body do not directly interact. Rather, they relate to each other by way of an intermediate layer of functioning. The indifference of Western scientists to the possibility of such an intermediate state is perhaps why, for them, the relationship between body and mind is so obscure. This may be why we've been stuck with a mind-body dualism, which seems to split our science of man asunder, leaving it in two separate and irreconcilable camps: that of the psychologist or humanist, and that of the physical scientist or laboratory researcher. Hard-nosed scientists are sure that anything worthy of study is physical and material. If they wish to deal with man's actions and behavior, they limit themselves to studying and measuring the movements of the body, the production of speech, or an individual's test performance. If they think of themselves as psychologists, they prefer to label themselves behavioral scientists. The mind itself they dismiss, convinced that it is not amenable to study. This seems to be a trend of the times, though in the past decade or two, the holistic health movement has begun to push open the door to broader awareness, a portal through which a handful of pioneering physicians and researchers have begun to step. Fortunately, in the East, and in particular among the practitioners of meditation, the relationship between body and mind has been thoroughly explored and found to constitute an intermediate link relating the body and the mind. It has its own properties and its own topography. Moreover, it is explicitly taught that this intermediate level has to do primarily with energy, the multi-leveled nature of man. The progress of Western science has forced us, slowly but surely, closer to this point of view. We have found it increasingly impossible to study the physical without becoming aware of phenomena that are non-physical, which we might even call energy. We end our study of anatomy by beginning to study physiology. We end our study of physiology by beginning to study the active integration of an organism as a whole. And this level of biological functioning always involves energy. Newtonian physicists were interested only in mechanics. They were concerned primarily with understanding how one physical body moved in relation to and was affected by another. In the 20th century, however, electromagnetism has become extremely important, as has the study of nuclear forces. More and more we have come to grapple with the questions: what is the relationship between matter and energy, between the physical realm and the realm of energy? What, in fact, is energy? If we can't see it, if it's not material, is it scientific to talk about? Obviously, energy is crucial. It makes us move. It makes our light bulbs glow. Whereas our state-of-the-art machinery of a century ago burned coal to make steam and push pistons. Our machinery of today has become more subtle, channeling energy through the tiniest of circuits to perform electronic miracles. How can we understand this phenomenon? Einstein seized this question and formulated an answer. E equals mc squared specifies a relationship between energy and matter. It also states that they're interconvertible. Matter can be changed into energy. The most dramatic applications of this were the atomic explosions, which snuffed out whole cities in Japan. Yet Einstein's formulation also states that energy can be converted into matter. The process doesn't only move in one direction. In Sanskrit, the level of functioning involving energy is called prana. Advanced meditators of previous ages found there's not only a relationship between the gross physical body and prana, but there's also a relationship between prana and the next higher level, the mind. Intuitively, and in our everyday expressions, we acknowledge the relationship between mind and energy. At times we experience a great deal of vitality and clarity of mind, while at other times we experience a lack of mental energy. Various schools of psychology have formulated this in more precise terms. For example, Freud called this energy libido. According to ancient yogic texts called the Upanishads, the various levels of existence form a continuum: the physical, the pranic, the mental, and the higher levels of consciousness. These levels are layered one upon the other. If the mind wants to affect the body, it alters the flow of energy or prana. If the body affects the mind, this too is accomplished through an effect on the flow of energy, which in turn has an impact on the mind. Prana is called the vital link between psyche and soma, vital, because energy is the very basis of life and vitality. When a person dies, the energy leaves. The body is still there, but the prana departs. Here we return to the matter of breath, because breath is the vehicle for prana. When someone dies and the vital energy departs, we say that person has expired. On the other hand, when someone experiences increased mental energy and creativity, we say that the person is inspired. We indicate through our language an intuitive recognition of the relationship between the inspiration, expiration, and the vital energy necessary for life and creativity. Yet this vital area of our existence is neglected in the Western study of man. This is an intriguing situation when we stop to think about it, for if it is true that breath influences both body and mind, then the rhythm and the rate of the breath would reflect not only one's physical condition, but would also help to create it. It would be an important indication of one's emotional and mental state. Therefore, what is going on inside a person could be judged from his breathing. And this is exactly what happens. Yogis sometimes appear to read minds simply by observing the quality of a person's breath. Constantly confronted with this rather obvious information, it is bizarre that we continue to ignore it. Here's something that takes place continually in the plain view of everyone, giving away the essence of our physical and mental states, giving away our secrets, so to speak, yet no one pays attention. The most fascinating and revealing kind of information is being broadcast, but no one is receiving it. We're always busy with our thoughts, which we shove around like a bric-a-brac in our head. We regard them as our most intimate treasures, no doubt because our overwhelming preoccupation is with the material world, and thoughts are the means by which we consciously process and our experiences and interactions with the universe outside ourselves. Yet if we were to become aware of prana and study it, we would find it is just as complicated as the body and almost as complicated as the mind. There are, for example, different qualities of energy, different patterns through which energy can flow. These vary tremendously, both qualitatively and quantitatively. In the Upanishads, the pranic level is described as a second body within the physical body called the vital sheath. The Upanishads say that it takes on the shape of the physical body. If we were able to look at one another, seeing past each other's physical body, we would perceive a subtle body instead, a body of energy. Not only is matter being pushed around through the veins and arteries and respiratory passages of our body, but changes in energy states are also taking place. Energy is being consumed in one place and produced or stored in another. It is being shifted from this point to that. So we might say there's an energy flow. If we could stand back and look at this continually shifting picture, we would be able to map out an overall pattern of flux. Even though most of us are not able to do this, we can still understand that something of this sort is actually constantly happening. This inner energy flow is such a delicate and intricate thing that some experts have spent their entire lifetime in its exploration. In the ancient literature of the yoga tradition, entire books have been written on this subject. These texts describe 5 major forms of prana, each having its own function. The pranic sheath has an extremely complex anatomy composed of pathways called nadis, through which the subtle energy flows. Next arises the question of how this pranic body is regulated so that we might see whether there is some possibility of developing the ability to consciously control it. Many variables have an impact on the pattern of energy flow, yogis claim. If one contracts a muscle of the arm, the overall flow changes to accommodate this. The one function which has the most central and strategic impact on the flow, however, is that of respiration. Breathing brings in oxygen for fuel and energy exchange. Its rate and rhythm, its course and depth, all have an effect on the way the body is energized. This determines whether energy comes in frequent, short bursts or in long, more gradual waves which establish a pulsating pattern of energizing the physical body and mind. If we were to study this pattern in depth, we could derive a wave from which would describe both the frequency of energizing inputs as well as their amplitude in any particular individual at any particular time. The flow of breath, then, is constantly helping to shape the pattern of energy flow that underlies and sustains the physical body. If we can grasp the significance of this, if we can understand the crucial way in which the energizing effects of the breath support the metabolic processes of different parts of the body, we can begin to understand how the physical aspects and activities of our body are created by and dependent on the process of breathing. With each breath, energy flows through the body in waves, constantly shaping and restructuring the pattern of energy which comprises the pranic body. If we look at physiology from this point of view, we begin to realize that the material body, which we have tended up to this time to regard as primary, is in fact secondary to an inner field of energy even more fundamental than itself. The flow of energy creates and sustains the tissues of the body, and if the energy pattern changes sufficiently, the physical body changes also. If the energy pattern is altered drastically enough, the body can be completely transformed for better or worse. People's bodies do change, but they usually change in minor ways. This may be in part because their characteristic pattern of energy flow is set and self-sustaining, since breathing habits tend to be deeply rooted in one's physiology, which has a momentum of its own. However, when individuals sit down and deliberately begin to work with the breath, they gradually begin to see changes in the way the body functions, and even in some cases, in its appearance. The same thing happens when people endure life experiences that have tremendous effects on the way the energy flows. A shock or injury or other trauma of some sort may result in a change of posture or an alteration in the way the internal organs operate. Individuals may lose weight, for instance, or their complexion may change, or their face and its shape may be altered. If the energy pattern shifts so that some part of the body is poorly supplied, undernourished, with prana, then it will eventually become sick and perhaps even die. Physical degeneration or a malignancy may result. Some sort of disease process will become evident, for the tissues cannot function without the energizing force that supports them. On the other hand, if one's left leg is amputated, a sense of still having a leg may persist for a long while. There are common reports of patients experiencing pain in a leg which has been amputated. The patient may feel that the leg is uncomfortable or in the wrong position, because the energy pattern around which the physical leg was structured requires some time to reorganize. Some animals are able to regenerate limbs which were lost. It would seem probable that this ability is based on the persistence of an energy flow to the area that was removed. Physical tissue crystallizes around the energy field that underlies it. After part of a leaf is torn away, its energy pattern remains intact for some time. This has been demonstrated through Kirlian photography. If this pattern could be maintained long enough, it is possible that the missing portion of the leaf would grow back. In fact, some plants do have the capacity to regenerate in this way. Without this underlying energy field around which to structure themselves, how would cells know where to grow? The same principle is evident in the animal kingdom, where we find one cell after fertilization developing into a complete animal or person. We have tended to account for this rather simplistically by saying that cells divide and redivide and eventually begin to differentiate. But how? How do some cells know they're supposed to change into neurons and some into muscle and others into bone? Presumably, the information that guides the cell is contained in the chromosome. However, each of these cells has the same chromosomal structure. Yogis claim the answer is that there's a field of pre-existing forces around which the cells shape themselves. If prana gives rise to the material level of phenomena, what we must wonder in turn controls the prana? According to the Upanishads, the pranayama kosha, or energy body, is fashioned and governed by a still deeper and more fundamental level of existence called the manomaya kosha, or mental body. This mental realm is even subtler than that of energy and still more difficult to identify, observe, and measure. Yet each of us experiences our own field of mental functioning. When we consider these yogic concepts, we discover that we have in some way bridged the mysterious gap between mind and body. Such ideas are jarring to our usual way of thinking, and yet somehow ring true. To understand our ambivalent response, we need to probe a bit deeper into the difference between how the yogi and the Westerner see themselves in relation to the universe. Cosmic breath. In this scientific era, we assume that the physical body gives rise to the mind, that the mind grows out of the body. According to this view, the fetus has essentially no mind. After birth, thought and consciousness gradually develop. We'll look at the cosmos the same way. Somewhere on the primordial earth, molecules randomly fell into place and life appeared. Over millions of years, more complex forms of life evolved, and eventually there emerged a conscious, self-aware being. But in the East, as in much of the ancient world, there has been a different, almost opposite view. Yoga philosophy insists that each of the levels of being evolves out of the one above it. Out of consciousness comes mind. Out of the mind comes the physical universe. Mind desired physical existence and so evolved the body in which to manifest itself. This is a vastly different way of looking at the world. It implies that the essence of our being lies beyond the physical and mental cosmos. It implies that we're all manifestations of an almost inconceivable form of consciousness which lies beyond the grosser levels of our existence. It is from there we came, and to there we will return. The entire universe flows out of that consciousness and ultimately flows back into its source like a tide that flows in and out. Oddly enough, some astronomers have arrived at a somewhat similar conclusion. It is the astronomer, of course, whose area of study pushes him hard up against the imponderables. His conceptualization of the geography of the universe forces him to deal with uncomfortable concepts like eternity and infinite space. Where does it all stop? And if time and space do end, what lies beyond them? Suddenly, we realize that human rationality is a poor tool with which to measure cosmic reality. Many astronomers today believe that the galaxies and planets are pulling apart from each other, that the space between celestial bodies is expanding due to an explosion from a dense center. This is the Big Bang theory, which also holds that after a certain point of expansion, the cosmos will begin to contract and all the planets, stars, and galaxies will be pulled back into yet another dense center from which it all explodes again. The process then is a familiar one of expansion and contraction. In a sense, it is nothing more than a cosmic inhalation and exhalation. All the levels of our existence can be seen as functioning harmoniously if we grasp the basic phenomenon of expansion and contraction, the cosmic breath. On one level, we manifest, we become people, we become physical, and then we return to consciousness. Hence it is that one can spend decades or even a lifetime delving into the subtleties and implications of the process of breathing. Developing awareness of breath. How to develop control over the pranic level of one's being seems deeply mysterious or occult to us in the West. Turning to the insights of the East, we find this is not actually so. According to the yogis, the principles of prana are simple and scientific. Training in the science of breath is time-consuming only because our culture and habits have led us away from a fine-tuned level of self-awareness. However, awareness of the breath can easily become a constant part of the way we function, act, feel, and think. Consider your left leg. Ordinarily, of course, you're not particularly worried about your left leg. At the moment, you're probably not thinking, oh, where shall I put this leg next? Or, my gosh, when I get up, I'm going to be able to remember how to move it. When you walk, you generally don't have to stop and think. No, the left comes after the right comes next, and then the left again, and I should remember to lift the toes so they won't drag on the ground. You rarely think about where exactly your left leg is, and yet you don't worry that you might have misplaced it. In a way, it really is amazing that you can sit there reading this book, interact with the people around you, listen for the telephone, and still keep up with that leg. This is possible because for years and years you've been using your legs. At first you may recall it wasn't so easy. It took several years for us to get it right. We started trying to put the leg, or at least the foot, into our mouth and making interesting discoveries along the way. We could wiggle our toes and feel a sharp pain if we bit into them. After a great deal of trial and error, however, we learned to walk, and before too long, we didn't even need to think about it. It might be helpful to look at the breath in the same way. It's a system we've got running on automatic now, just like walking, yet the breath is also something of which we can be constantly aware. Yogis who are masters of Svarodaya, the science of breath, claim to be aware of every breath they take. We come now to the most crucial point of all, the key to yoga science. Breathing is the only physiological process that can be either voluntary or involuntary. Individuals can breathe consciously, making the breath do whatever they wish, or they can ignore it and the body simply breathes on its own. The body can't operate without breath, so if conscious control of the breath is abandoned, then some unconscious part of the mind reflexively begins to function and starts breathing for us. In this case, breathing falls back under the control of primitive parts of the brain, an unconscious realm of the mind where emotions, thoughts, and feelings, of which we may have little or no awareness, become involved and can wreak havoc with the rhythms of our breath. The breath may become haphazard and irregular when we lose conscious control of it. The same thing, of course, can happen with your left leg. Sometimes people develop problems with their feet because of the way they use or rather misuse them. If you neglect your left foot, then instead of sensing, oh, there's too much pressure on the lateral insole, and making an adjustment, you simply go on walking as usual. Eventually, the foot becomes twisted and distorted. Then you pay a podiatrist a hefty fee to show you some foot exercises, slowly bringing the foot back into your awareness so it can begin to function properly and heal. The same thing happens with the breath. It can either be allowed to run haphazardly and create havoc in the body and mind, or it can become a part of your constant awareness and be harmoniously coordinated. And once the breath is integrated into your awareness, you'll wonder how you ever got along before. People who have been injured and haven't walked for some time may develop the habit of ignoring the lower half of their body. They live from the waist up. What's above the waist is alive, whereas what's below is dead weight. As these people recover the functioning of the injured half, they go through an elaborate process of learning how to use their legs again. They have to extend their awareness back down into their legs, which requires hard work because they had mentally disavowed that part of themselves, ignoring it, cutting it off. And here's the problem we begin to confront when we learn about breathing. We must bring back into our awareness a whole area of ourselves that we've cut off, gradually reintegrating it into our consciousness. The more we make it part of our constant awareness, the more it becomes a vital dimension of ourselves. At that point, the teachings of pranayama, breath control, begin to make sense. Through constant awareness and experience, we discover for ourselves what happens when we breathe through one nostril or the other. We notice that when the breath switches from the right to the left nostril, there's a shift of physical and mental tone. For example, having lunch today with the left nostril open is followed by the realization that the food didn't sit as well as usual. The scriptures say we should eat only when the right nostril is open, because the emotions are closely related to the breath. By altering our respiratory rhythm, we should be able to shift emotional gears. This is something we can try out, experiment with from moment to moment. In this way, the science of breath ceases to be more theory and becomes part of practical experience, vastly enriching our self-knowledge. This awareness comes gradually. The stage for this self-exploration is set by understanding the mechanics of prana and by the regular practice of breath awareness and breathing exercises. The result is an awakening of a whole part of ourselves that we didn't know was there before, a completely new aspect of our being to which our eyes had been closed. Svarodaya, the science of breath, opens our inner awareness to the very energy that gives us life and shapes our being. A lot of very interesting and vital, of course, points about the importance of our breath. Breath is energy, breath is life, and when we engage with our breath in a mindful way, regularly, we literally transform ourselves. We retrain our awareness and bring our awareness back to our own breathing. When we're born, right before the moment of our birth, we don't breathe. At least we don't breathe in the sense of taking a breath with our lungs. The exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen takes place through the umbilical cord while we are in utero. But the moment we're born, there's a gasp. There's an inspiration of air. It's a programmed experience in that we don't think about it because our body is forced into taking a breath. And as soon as we take that breath, we now are engaged with our outside world. We no longer are dependent on the umbilical cord and the exchange of gases. So when we bring ourselves back to the very first breath that gave us life on the outside world and continues to, we realize how vital it is, because it's our vitality, as the authors suggest. It is life. Such a basic physiological process, yet we are completely disengaged from it. And if we simply regularly practice our breathing techniques or mindful breathing, ignoring the techniques, no techniques, just simply breathing, mindful breathing, we reprogram and retrain our unconscious mind to make it much more conscious, in a way. What is your practice? What is your daily practice that you engage in? And meditation is really just the practice of awareness. So what are your practices? I'm really interested in learning what gives you that connection to feeling the warmth of the air that comes in and out of your nostrils, the connection that you have to the outside world. Our respiratory system, our lungs, our nose, these are direct connection to the outside world. Think about the fact that trees take in carbon dioxide and then give off oxygen. We take in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. It's the cycle of life. It never stops. Think about that for a moment. How we are just part of that cycle. We give life to trees and trees give life to us, and we're just part of we are nature. We are part of that cycle. Thanks for sharing this with me. In the meantime, stay well, be well, and I look forward to being with you again.